Yes, so thank you so much to all those present. I'm delighted to see all of you here for this very first session of this research seminar that I organized from 2019. So this is the 5th year. So the title of the seminar is Description, Evaluation and Prescription in Economics and Philosophy. The main goal of the seminar is basically to highlight the inevitable role of norms, I mean ethical, moral, and political norms in what economists do when they describe phenomena, when they evaluate them, and when they prescribe various policies or structural reforms to address a whole range of social and political problems. This question of the normative foundations of descriptions, evaluation, and prescriptions is very important. This is one of the main stakes of George's amazing book that I will discuss in a short while. But in fact, historically speaking, since mainly the beginning of the 20th century, under the influence of scholars as diverse as Pareto, who was here where I'm now based in Lausanne, but also Ludwig von Mises and Lionel Robbins. The argument is that basically norms, all normative issues, they are subjective. There's nothing objective about them. So all discussions about them tend to be somewhat arbitrary. Therefore, we should basically exclude them from economics if we want economics to be a serious, rigorous, objective discipline. Now, of course, a whole range of scholars have, specifically in the past 4 decades, problematized this approach. The use of, for example, scholars showing the eminent role of big concepts in economics. Putnam comes to mind, but also Anna Alexandrova, but also George Book, concepts such as harm, precisely, which tend to be both positive and normative, basically. So because of the use of these terms, but also other scholars have shown how the normative predilections of economists tend to influence their work, even their positive work. The scholars working on the performative consequences of economic theories, which shows how even positive economics can have unintended normative consequences. And last but not least, specifically economists in working on feminist economics, but also on ecological economics, have shown the significant role of moral, ethical, and political norms, even when it comes to purely epistemic discussions, even the choice of epistemic values when economists discuss various issues. Non-epistemic values tend to be very influential. So all these works, I think, have shown to a large extent how normative issues are central. And therefore, I think what the main goal of this seminar is to highlight the work of those who have problematized the normative deficit of economics, but also those who have tried to offer alternative approaches. Basically, those who have tried to rectify this normative deficit of economics, which has had really detrimental consequences for economics as a discipline regarding its descriptions, its evaluations, and its prescription. So for this very first session, I have the immense pleasure of welcoming George DeMartino. Basically, I think I would have really struggled to find a better commencement. Basically, a scholar whose work fits this well with what this seminar is about. So George is the Josef Korbel is a professor of international economics at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver and the former president of the Association for Social Economics. He has written, I'd be thankful if you could maybe Please activate your. Sorry, I'm good. Okay, so I think now it should be better. Yes, if you don't mind when you do not speak, be thankful if you could mute your microphone. So yes, so the introduction of George. So George has written numerous really outstanding books and papers, notably Global Economy, Global Justice, Theoretical and Policy Alternatives to Neoliberalism, published by Routledge in 2000. Then The Economist's Oath, published by Oxford University Press in 2011. The Oxford Handbook of Professional Economic Ethics, a major contribution to ethical dimensions of economics. A book he co-edited with Miklowski, and most recently, The Tragic Science, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2022. This book has received huge praise and critical acclaim by a large number of scholars, major economists, other social scientists have reviewed the book. I think I can really say, having read at least 6 or 7 reviews of the book, that most of those who have read the book share the same idea that it is a major contribution to discussions involving the moral and epistemological shortcomings of economics, but also, this is also one of the major contributions of the books, alternatives, solutions to rectify at least some of these shortcomings. So thank you so much, George, for your presence, which means so much to me. I would give you the floor without any further ado. And as I said, you would have at least, let's say, up to an hour, and then we'll have around half an hour for the Q&A. Just one point before giving you the floor. When George presents, if you have questions of clarification, please mention them in the chat. And at some points, I would regroup them and ask George to try to basically discuss them. But if you have questions, overall questions, general questions about what George will be saying, please keep them for after the talk. Because as I said, after the talk, we will have at least half an hour for the Q&A. So keep your questions preferably for after the talk. Again, thank you so much for your participation. The floor is yours, George.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by sharing my screen, and if I can get this to work, just give me one more second and then I'll jump in.
Καλησπέρα.
Okay.
Yes, είχα πάρει τηλέφωνο για αυτό το...
Are we good? Can we see the screen? Am I sharing the screen properly? Yeah?
Yes, yes, perfect.
Perfect. All right. First of all, Sina, thank you so much for that overly generous introduction. I did not know of this seminar series until very recently, at which point I reached out to Sina to see whether presenting here might be appropriate, and he was so kind as to invite me to do that, and now here I am, and I couldn't be happier. And I certainly look forward, Sina, to participating in these future events now that I am aware of this extraordinary gathering of people around questions that have been bothering me since I began to study economics in the late 80s. The connection between the normative and the positive, and what do we make of this, and where should we go with it? And that's been my trajectory. I'll just say one word about this. My trajectory has been toward looking at the normative issues in policy assessment and things like that. Sina mentioned my first book, Global Economy, Global Justice, that kind of took a normative lens to the debate then raging in the 1990s over what kind of global economy we should be building. But by the early 2000s, by 2007, 8, 9, I turned my lens toward a normative critique of my own profession. And I'd have to say the primary job I've been pursuing since the 2008, 2009. It's a grandiose project, I understand, so you can criticize me for this, but it's to contribute toward the creation of a field that needs to exist, that has never existed in our profession, the profession of professional economic ethics. Now, were we trained as lawyers, engineers, social workers, journalists, go right down the line, we would have a body of professional ethics, in some fields very well developed, in others not so well developed, that we would be immersed in and that would have something to say about how we comport ourselves in our work. And yet economics has never invested energy and time into the creation of a body of research and argument and debate about what does it mean to be an ethical economist, and what would it mean for economics to be an ethical profession. I find there, of course, there are outstanding individuals who have been raising these questions in one way or another. I've gravitated toward the work of the outstanding Austrian economist Deirdre McCloskey precisely for this reason. Deirdre and I agree on nothing other than this, that we both are deeply disturbed by the ethical conduct of our profession and the lack of a serious conversation about what ethical behavior even requires of us in economics. And that's what I have been doing for the last, now almost 20 years, trying to contribute in one way or another to the creation of this new field. Today, I want to talk about a new book that has just been published that Sina mentioned, The Tragic Science. I'm going to focus on just one piece of that book, the problem of irreparable ignorance and why this induces harm. Here's the background. This is the book, The Tragic Science. How economists cause harm even as they aspire to do good. And of course, if you know Deirdre's work and the work of other Austrians, you'll see that there's a natural affinity here, at least with the question. Why is it that economists contribute to so much harm, even if we give them the benefit of the doubt that they're aspiring to do good? The book is making a number of different arguments. And when I talk about the book, I typically either talk about the nature of harm and the way in which economists are trained to trivialize the harm that we contribute to. Then separately, I give talks on the epistemic problem. It turns out, I have found now, having talked about this book quite a bit, that people tend not to push back on the critique of how the harm question, the fact that we cause harm and that we don't then properly theorize it. I'm going to talk about that for just 5 minutes today. When I present on the epistemic problem, I get a lot of pushback. And so today, given the nature of this audience with philosophers of science and people who study the history of economics and the like, I've decided to present the part of the book that causes the most anguish. It's the epistemic critique, because I'm really quite interested to hear whether you think I've got it really wrong. If after this talk is over, someone asks you, what did DeMartino argue? Here it is. Economists know nothing. Economists know nothing. That's something that I've come to conclude after a long journey. I'm going to refer to it as the epistemic problem today. I'm going to argue that, in fact, we face what I call irreparable ignorance. This is ignorance that cannot be repaired. It concerns questions about what we can't ever know. Now, a number of economists over the years who have influenced all of us in this meeting today have pointed to the epistemic problem. I'm by no means the first. I'm going to suggest that the problem tends to be much worse than we tend to infer from many of the leading thinkers in this area. And yet, to this day, economic practice often involves repressing the epistemic problem. We construct what I call time travel machines. That's what our models are, time travel machines that purport to let us see 20 years out today. And of course, time travel machines cannot exist. And so I take issue with this in the book, as you can imagine. Even those economists who tend to be aware of the epistemic problem, nevertheless, seem to find ways to justify continuing to do what we've always done in economics. And I will argue that it's through a series of beliefs. I'm going to call them epistemic myths. There's a series of beliefs that authorize us to essentially continuing doing things we should not be doing. I'm going to take us through just four of these, what I call epistemic myths, and then of course present short refutations to those myths. If we have time, and I've promised Sina I won't go on forever, I'm going to talk about what doing better might mean. That's the last two chapters of the book are on this question. I hope we have a chance to get to it, but we'll have to see. So that's where we're going today. We're going to talk about the epistemic problem, but first I want to discuss the motivation. I get so frustrated when I read, for lack of a better term today, let's say mainstream economists who celebrate the profession without attending to the damage that we do. You might ask me, is this still a problem today? I will argue the answer is absolutely yes. Here's a book that was edited by John Siegfried. If you don't know John Siegfried, he was the Secretary Treasurer of the American Economics Association for quite a long time. As a consequence, of his own very good work, he was connected to the leading thinkers in our profession. He published a book in 2010 called Better Living Through Economics. This is to be an assessment of the ways in which economics has made the world better. And it's a fascinating book. I teach one chapter, the chapter on trade liberalization, and the benefits of trade liberalization is written by Anne Kruger. And in that chapter, if you were to read it, you would see that she celebrates free trade, talks about how free trade saved the world. One of the cases she uses is South Korea. But there's no discussion of the downsides of trade. And that's odd. In reading it, I went back and looked at the editor's introduction to the book. And you find this. I may read a good bit of this, I don't know. Siegfried has this to say in the beginning of the book, one of the very first pages. He says, look, if a policy is consistent with Kaldor-Hicks compensation principle, that is, the gains to the winners are greater than the losses to the losers, he goes on to say, then, at least in theory, the policy change could be constructed to make some people better off while making no one else worse off. Absent such considerations as envy and relative income issues, the policy change might be declared a good thing. He then says, unfortunately, however, matters are not quite so simple. Thank God he says that. Whether, in fact, compensation actually must be paid, or whether it is sufficient that it could be paid, even though, in fact, it is not paid, remains controversial. And now here's the key, the highlighted text. The chapters in this volume, by and large, ignore such distributional considerations. To do otherwise would drag the analysis into a morass it could hardly escape, end quote. Now, reading this as a professional economist, we're not startled or stunned by this. We know this problem exists, and we know that there's a long tradition of just sweeping it under the rug so that we can get on with the business of saving the world through our expertise. But when you read this from the perspective of non-economists, if they really are paying attention to what's going on here, this is an outstanding maneuver. It says to the world, yes, there are problems that are fundamentally difficult. They concern the deepest value controversies. So here's how we're going to deal with them. We are just not going to deal with them. These kinds of statements and this kind of practice drives me a little wild. And I have to say, it is part of what has been motivating me for years to do whatever little bit I can to force economists to really take account of the maneuvers they use to justify doing things we have no business doing. And that is what carried forward into the new book, this concern that we don't grapple with harms that we contribute to in the ways that we should. For me, it's a very simple argument. We have enormous influence in the world. We earn that influence through I shouldn't say earn, we secured that influence through 100 years of doing everything we could to increase the influence of economists in the world of public policy and beyond. The belief is that a world in which we have more influence is better than a world in which we have less influence. I'll come back to that much later in the talk. The problem is, and I'll come back to this too, we enjoy tremendous influence, but we have no control over what happens in the world. And when you enjoy influence, but you can't control the outcome of that influence, you stand to cause tremendous harm. I would argue, despite the wonderful dissenting voices who have tried to bring this to the economics profession's attention, we, the profession, have tended to repress the problem and gone about blithely intervening in ways that have induced harm. I find this, without a serious conversation about what this means, I find this to be unsustainable morally. The way we tend to deal with this problem in economics, we know we cause harm, but we want to continue to do what we do to promote social betterment is through what I call moral geometry. Moral geometry entails taking really complicated, maybe even irresolvable moral issues and reducing them down to something really tractable in economics, simple math problems. We then convince ourselves that once we've solved the math problem, we've also solved the moral problem. But of course, we haven't. All we've done is solved a trivial math problem. I'm talking about decision rules. When I talk about moral geometry in economics, I'm talking about the decision rules that we are all trained in that allow us to pass judgment about policy, even policy that might be objectionable on one ground or another. Of course, the famous Pareto criteria, but then the Kaldor-Hicks potential Pareto test, cost-benefit analysis, the use of social welfare functions to calculate when a policy actually promotes social betterment and when it doesn't. Of course, there's a million other simple decision rules that you are all aware of. Of course, the problem is that there's not just one moral geometry, as you can see here. There's, in principle, innumerable decision rules one could apply. One would then need to, if one thinks one needs moral geometry and should use moral geometry, one would then need a meta-moral geometry to tell us which moral geometry to use in any particular case. About that, also, there is no agreement. There are innumerable meta-moral geometries. And so what tends to happen, economists tend to pick and choose the moral geometry in any particular case that gives them the result that they wanted at the beginning of the analysis. Do I sound skeptical here? Of course, I'm a skeptic in this regard. I am entirely unpersuaded when I read a cost-benefit analysis about anything, and I think that you should be unpersuaded too. By the way, just to give credit where it's due, the concept of moral geometry, which I use throughout the book, actually comes to us from a philosopher who I think does wonderful work, Howard B. Radist. He talks about moral geometry in the domain of moral and especially moral philosophy, also political philosophy. He argues beautifully, I won't read you the quote, you can get these slides later, that look, moral geometry is a game we play with ourselves in order to allow us to think that we have something reasonable to say about pressing issues that involve irresolvable moral dilemmas. He says, sadly, moral geometry fails us. It forces us to simplify what cannot really be simplified. I have found this way of thinking from Radis to be extraordinarily helpful to me as I navigate what we call welfare economics. All right, all of that is the kind of talk I give on separate occasions, and then I go into those arguments in great depth. Today, I don't want to do that. I just wanted to give you background on that. Here's where I want to go. Several of the chapters in the book examine the epistemic problem in economics, the idea that there are things that we don't know that we would want to know. There are things we can't ever know. That's why I call this irreparable ignorance. There are things we can't ever know that we would need to know to do much of what it is we already do in the profession. And that's what I want to explore with you today. I see this as a significant contributor to the harm that economists help to induce in the world. And I think that this needs to be addressed. Now, of course, pick your economic hero. There are a number of great intellects who we can follow on from: Frank Knight, John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, John Hicks, and many. If we were to go to the present, there'd be many following Hicks, or at the same time, there'd be Albert O. Hirschman, but many others, up to the, of course, one of my heroes, Deirdre McCloskey, who have been making this argument that there are things that we cannot know that we economists need to know and want to know to do much of what we're doing. For Knight, of course, the distinction between uncertainty and risk. John Maynard Keynes, talking about all kinds of things in the future. About these matters, there is no scientific basis whatsoever to form probability calculations. We simply do not know. Hayek, of course, is at the head of the class when it comes to these kinds of an appreciation of the limits to knowledge. John Hicks, who you may not associate with this way of thinking, also was there to warn us, as was, going way back, was Robbins, who was deeply critical of any notion that we know as much as we think. But now I want to turn to another theorist who is terribly important in this connection, G.L.S. Shackle. And what's interesting about Shackle is he now, of course, he's a student, a close student of Knight and Keynes, and I presume also Hayek. He introduces a distinction that I think, with the possible exception of Hayek, these other scholars I've just been talking about tended to hold, at least implicitly. If I'm wrong about that, I'd love to be corrected. He makes a distinction between our knowledge of the past and our knowledge of the future. And he articulates he presents the idea of an epistemic pivot, or how do I want to say this? Just a fundamental epistemic category when one's comparing what we know about the past and what we know about the future. And I'm going to read this quote, or if you have already, then follow along. "The vital and fundamental difference between the nature and meaning of the content of time past or present and the content of time to come was brought into brilliant focus by the Swedish economists Myrdal and Lindahl with ex ante ex post. To name the 2 points of view, and this is the key, that of the forward look into the void of unknowledge when we look into the future, and the backward look into the past with its ascertainable history," end quote. Now, I don't know that others articulate this quite so directly and so well, but my sense is that many, if not most economists who really understand the uncertainty problem tend to make this distinction between a knowable, relatively speaking, past and an unknowable future. And of course, the intuition is quite clear. About the past, we have knowledge of many things. We know that event A was followed by event B, which was followed by event C. And we have some good knowledge about the value of variables at various intervals. So we can map out a series of events and the values of variables. As concerns the future, we can't do that. If one understands the uncertainty angle, we can't do that. We don't know the value of the rate of inflation 18 months hence. We can't do it. But I want to suggest to you that the epistemic distinction is untenable as concerns one of the primary things that economists do and that economists need to do in order to do much of what they're doing. I want to focus on one kind of knowledge, which is to say causal knowledge. And as concerns causal knowledge, I'm going to argue that there is no epistemic distinction between our knowledge of the past and our ignorance about the future. I will argue that we are equally ignorant about causality in the past, the present, as we are causality in the future. And that's where we're going. In the book, I introduced this category of irreparable ignorance. I want to take a minute before we get too deep into things to tease out some of the, let's call it some of the domains of irreparable ignorance, because we can be irreparably ignorant in different ways in different contexts. The first is deferred knowledge. This is knowledge that we may very well get in the future. It's not unattainable, except that it's information or knowledge that is unattainable, or not known in the moment the missing knowledge is needed for decision making. So it's not out of our grasp of eventually, but it's not available when we need it. Shackle was brilliant on this point. What is the best action is wholly dependent on the unique historical situation. And any knowledge of that situation, which is lacking when it is needed, is effectively lacking forever and is forever too late. I think he's got his finger exactly on the problem. Knowledge we need today that to make a decision today that isn't available till tomorrow is effectively lacking forever. That's the first category. Let's call it deferred knowledge. The second category of irreparable ignorance is similar, except there's a twist. Let's call it I call it a cruel conundrum. It's knowledge that we need to make a decision, but which we can only acquire by making the decision. So we can't just wait to make the decision. You can't just wait for the knowledge to come to us. The only way to get there is by making the decision that we require, making the decision for which the knowledge was necessary. And so imagine you're lost I live in Colorado. Imagine you're lost in those Colorado mountains for several days. You're now famished. You come across a berry bush and you are desperate to eat and to get nutrients and moisture or liquids from the berries. You ask yourself, are these berries food or are they poison? The cruel conundrum is there's only one way to find out, and that one way is by eating the berries. In this kind of case, waiting for more information is never an option, since the information can only be gleaned by actually taking the action. The third category, this is the category I'm going to talk about with you today. This is what I just call, for lack of a better term, the in principle unknowable. This is Shackle's, so what would fall under this category? Well, knowledge of the future. This is Shackle's void of unknowledge. But what about his ascertainable past? Is there no irreparable ignorance when we apprehend the past? I want to argue that, in fact, the past is not apprehendable when we're looking at a certain kind of knowledge, or when we're in need of a certain kind of knowledge, causal knowledge. I want to talk about economic causality. And there are times, Sina, when I give an entire talk just on what I'm going to do here on this slide or the next two slides. So if I go too fast, please just interrupt me, because this is very important to me, but I want to cover other things as well. So let me just break into it. Maybe this is something we could talk about more in the Q&A. I want to argue that when we are trying to talk about economic causality, some X causing some other Y, some event X causing some other event Y, we run up against the irresolvable counterfactual problem. The problem comes to us because of what philosopher Paul Holland calls the fundamental problem of causal knowledge. And the fundamental problem of causal knowledge is this: to know whether some event X caused some other event Y, let me back up. Let's imagine in the world we are observing, some event X happens and then some event Y happens. First X, then Y. And the question the researcher has is, did X cause Y? In some sense or other, did X cause Y? In order to know that, we can't just observe that X happened and then Y happened. We would have to compare the world in which X happened and then Y happened against an alternative world in which X happened and then Y did not happen. We'd have to run history twice. In the first case, just as the world is, just observing what happened. In the second case, we'd have to rewind the historical tape, go right back to the moment when X happened, this time erase X from the historical record and wait to see if Y happens. Now, this is lovely. This is what we would need to do. The problem is history only runs once. In the historical literature, and especially in the methodological literature, this question of running history once, it becomes apparent when we ask questions like this. And this is a case that comes right out of the counterfactual literature. Did the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June of 2014, did it cause World War I in some sense or other? Now, in order to get, some people think it did. Some people think that that assassination was fundamental to the train of events that then kicked off World War I just a couple of months later. Other historians disagree. Now, the only way to resolve this debate, if we could really get knowledge of it rather than just conjecture about it, would be to run history twice. Once the way the world actually unfolded, assassination happens, World War I breaks out. Then we would have to rewind the tape to the moment he's about to be assassinated, have the assassin lose his nerve and not shoot the Archduke, so the assassination doesn't happen, and then watch to see whether World War I breaks out. But of course, think about what we're doing here. We can only watch the world once because history only unfolds once. So we have to concoct in our imaginations an image of a fictitious world, fictitious because, in fact, Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. We'd have to concoct a fictitious world in our mind and then watch to see in that imaginary world in our minds what would have happened. The point here is this. We can't run history 2 to n times. It only runs once. In order to overcome the fundamental problem of causal knowledge, we then look for ways to simulate the rerunning of history 2 through n times to try and tease out causality. But that means that our causal claims about the world, our social world, depend on claims about hypothetical worlds that exist only in our minds. They are inherently fictions, and I would therefore claim causal claims in economics are grounded in nothing more than our fictitious accounts of imaginary worlds. If you come at economics from this perspective, then we have a way of understanding all the alternative methods in economics. What are these alternative methods? This is a key point for me. They're not what they pretend to be. They're not alternative methods for seeing what is out there in the world. They are alternative methods for concocting the uniquely right counterfactual. They are methods for seeing what can't ever be seen, what's going on in our counterfactual worlds that we need to claim in order to sustain causality claims about the world we inhabit. Now, those folks who have given the most time to thinking about this understand this issue. Here's Tetlock and Belkin. Tetlock is a very important political scientist who does a lot of great work on expertise and the limits to expertise, but he also does very good work on in my view, on methodology. And he's among those who argue something like what I just had to say. Researchers must ultimately justify claims that a given cause produced a given effect by involving counterfactual arguments about what would have happened in some hypothetical world, blah, blah, and you can read the rest. In economics, the person who these days seems to be most aware of this problem at the highest levels in our profession, I think a Nobel Prize winner, is J.J. Heckman. And take a look at what Heckman has to say. And he's, by the way, he's got a number of papers where he comes at this in all sorts of ways. So if you're interested in this issue, you could do far worse than to begin your investigations by looking at Heckman's methodology. A causal relationship is only well defined if a theory of potential counterfactuals is articulated and a mechanism generating variation in the causes is clearly specified. Now, this is what I want you to pay attention to. Both steps are pre-statistical and require thought experiments involving counterfactuals in imaginary worlds. Now, if you understand that this is where our causal claims come from, that they depend for their validity on the validity of our counterfactual claims, then you have a problem. You need to know there are, in principle, innumerable counterfactual claims that can be made. They're limited only by our imaginations. So we need to have criteria or a science to tell us which is the uniquely right counterfactual. And as in fact, when you look at Tetlock and Belkin and others, they then turn to an exploration of criteria we should use in order to judge different counterfactual claims so that we know which is the right counterfactual claim, so we then know what is the right causal claim. Now, even if you haven't read this literature, I think you can intuit and anticipate where this literature ends up. It ends up in fundamental disagreement. There's no agreement among counterfactualizing methodologists about what are the right criteria to impose in order to ensure we have the right counterfactual. And that shouldn't be surprising, because what they're adjudicating is what's the right way to distinguish between competing fantasies that can't ever be seen. Because they can't ever be seen, they can never be checked or verified empirically. And so we're actually talking about how to judge social science fiction. And on that count, there is no consensus. All right, that is, Sina, I'm going to leave it there. The point I'm making again is we can't know causality in the way we think we, or hope we can know causality, because ultimately they're grounded in fictitious claims about fantastical worlds. I therefore draw the conclusion that our causal claims too are nothing but fictions. That doesn't mean they don't matter. They matter hugely in the world, but they're not grounded in what we think they are, the empirical evidence or theoretical propositions. They're grounded in a fantasy, alternative fantasies about counterfactual worlds. There's so much more to be said about this. I'd be delighted to get back to it in Q&A, but I want to move on to other arguments about why it is that we know nothing, which is, after all, my claim. I just want to give credit where it's due to the kinds of people who have been making these kinds of arguments much more recently than the quote unquote founding fathers I talked about earlier. Of course, I've mentioned Deirdre McCloskey now several times. The extraordinary feminist economist Julie Nelson. Nassim Taleb, I think, is just outstanding on the epistemic issue. His work, The Black Swan, and everything he's written since is worth careful consideration by those who are worried about epistemic issues. There are the post-Keynesians, of course, the other Austrians besides Hayek and McCloskey, the post-structuralists. There are Althusserian Marxists. I know this because that's my training. Of course, those influenced by Albert Hirschman. This broad group, we disagree about all sorts of things, but there's really extraordinary insights on the epistemic problem that emanate from all these schools of thought. It's one of these places, it's one of the rare places in economics where the conversations across ideological divides can be really productive. And I think Deirdre and I have proven that through our own collaborations. What's interesting for me is that recently what we might call loosely mainstream economists are coming to accept the problem as if they were always aware of it, which of course is not true. Kenneth Rogoff, as any academic macroeconomist will tell you, that's clearly not true. This is an aspiration on his part, maybe. It's not empirically true. The global economy never ceases to be uncertain and unpredictable. And then we've got Orzag, Rubin, and Stiglitz emphasizing impossible to predict events. The crisis of 2007, 2008 was so good for our profession in this sense that it seems to have induced a degree of epistemic humility that had gone missing for quite a while. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. The point is, there's an increasing interest in the epistemic problem in our profession today than there has been in quite a while, and I think that this is a wonderful thing. Here's Edward Leamer, who I think is about the best on this. Now, this comes from his textbook, but the textbook is called Macroeconomic Patterns and Stories. Now, that's a strange way to talk about a textbook. It's not macroeconomic science, macroeconomic patterns and stories, and this quotation deserves our attention. So I'm going to read it to you, and then I'll stop reading quotes. You may want to substitute the more familiar scientific words theory and evidence for patterns and stories. Do not do that. The words theory and evidence suggest an incessant march toward a level of scientific certitude that cannot be attained in the study of complex, self-organizing human systems that we call the economy. The words patterns and stories much more accurately convey our level of knowledge now and in the future as well. It is literature, not science. Now, again, I was trained in the 1980s, 1990s. I never came across leading let's call them again, mainstream economists with these kinds of insights about the narrative nature of economics. I had to learn that from McCloskey, not from the more if you want to call them this, the more mainstream theorists. So I think Lemur's right. I think Lemur's entirely right on this for reasons you can now intuit from everything I've had to say. And yet, it's funny. I think we know this. I think a lot of economists know this. I give a lot of talks on the epistemic problem. And when I talk to applied economists, the ones out there in the economy actually doing economics, many of them will tell me that they have always been aware that we know so little. And yet they earn their paychecks by doing this work every day. We as a profession, we repress the problem, even though individuals are aware of it. We think of our models and our methods as providing us with time travel machines. Again, I talked about this earlier. What do our models do? What does a CGE model do? It allows us, we think, to tell the world what will happen in 2045 today in 2023. The only way we could possibly ever do that is by traveling to the year 45, seeing and then coming back. But that's what we do. Our profession does every day when we do long-term forecasting or even short-term forecasting, cost-benefit analysis, CGE modeling, economic impact analysis, forensic economic practice. It's all about treating our profession as if we have access to time travel machines that others just don't have. I'm going to skip over this, but if you're interested, you should get the slides. There was an extraordinary controversy over the TPP, which is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. The Peterson Institute on the one hand against JITA at Tufts University on the other hand, each using their models as time travel machines to tell us exactly what was going to happen 25 years out as a consequence of the TPP. It's time travel machines all the way down. All right. I want to be clear. Many economists are aware of the problem, and yet I want to suggest that we continue to justify our influence in the world when really, if you take what I'm saying on board, we have no business having this much influence in the world. How do we square that circle? How do we justify continuing to do what we do, even if we have no good epistemic basis for it? I think I'm going to take you through 4 what I call epistemic myths. There are others, but here's 4. We'll go through them one by one and see what the claim is and what I think is objectionable about it. The first, it's not our fault that we're doing what we really shouldn't be doing. This is what's expected of us. But here's the problem with the "it's not our fault" argument. What is expected of us comes from a public that we ourselves have trained to expect certain things from us. I'm thinking about the hundreds of thousands of students who are sitting in an economics 101 class right now while you and I are having this conversation, and they are being trained in the capacities and the extraordinary knowledge of the economics profession. We, the suppliers of the service, instruct the citizens, the consumers of the service, in what it is we can provide. When they then come back to us later on and say, please give me a 25-year forecast of the impact of this policy, they're only asking us what it is we've trained them to ask of us. The source of the problem is us, in how we present the profession, the way we present ourselves as having tremendous capacities and these little time travel machines. The emphasis is on what we know, what we can do. The emphasis in Econ 101 is not on our epistemic limits. I want to suggest that the reason for this is a sociological one. We are driven, our profession, to have more influence in the world. And the way we do this is through deception, by presenting ourselves as knowing the unknowable. We don't want to supply arms to the barbarians, as Danny Roderick puts it in his discussion of dishonesty in economics. He says we don't want to supply arms to the barbarians, and so we deceive into the public into thinking that we know more than we do. The basis for believing that is if they just put their faith in us, the world will be better off. So the refutation is this: we've trained them to expect what they expect from us. We can't therefore then blame them for asking us to do things that we shouldn't be doing. Myth number two, even if we get it wrong, the world is better served with us doing what we do than it would be without. Now, if you've ever come across a counterfactual argument, this is it. Imagine a world where we have the influence we do. Imagine a world where we don't have as much influence. The claim is that in that alternative world, which we can't inhabit, that in that alternative world, the world would necessarily be worse off. I think that this is just a self-serving deception on our part. We're probably deceiving ourselves first, but it's also self-serving. Here I go back to all those who've made the obvious claim. If you're in a city like Rome and the only map you have is the map of London, are you really better off using the map than you would be in Rome with no map at all? Of course, you're better off in Rome not referring to the map of London. Pseudo-knowledge, fake knowledge, knowledge that presents itself as being grander than it is, it can have all sorts of deleterious effects. Too often, not always, that's what the economist profession provides. I want to get back to this point about influence. This was a fundamental reason for the founding of the AEA in 1885. The goal was to expand the profession's influence, and with forgetting a fundamental problem. That influence does not equal control. We can have a lot of influence in the world and no control. The problem is influence without control is very, very dangerous. The way I think about this is a little kid, Johnny, a 10-year-old child, he's gotten behind his dad's or his mom's Humvee, big car. He's careening down Main Street, cannot drive, and he's going left to right. Now, does little Johnny influence about what's going to happen next? Oh, yeah. But does little Johnny control what's about to happen? Of course, the answer is he doesn't. It's an example of influence without control. Economists too often forget that they enjoy influence, but they don't enjoy control. And when you mistake influence for control and you act in the world as if you have control, you are in position to do horrible damage. I call this the Jeffrey Sachs and Russia problem. Those of you who have studied Stuckler and Basu or Stuckler, King and McKee will know why. I think the leading Sachs is just representative of the thinking of the day. He's not an outlier. He just had more influence than most. I think there was a tendency a long-standing tendency in our profession to forget that you may have influence, but you will never enjoy control. And therefore, you'd better modulate your behavior to take account of the fact that as you increase your influence, you may increase the damage that you cause. Myth number 3. Okay, our science is imperfect, but don't worry, our science is progressing over time. We therefore know more today than we did in the past, so there's less we don't know. Our science is improving. The image I use in the book is just this little simple one. Knowledge, the presumption is that knowledge expands. You almost have to think, to get at this, you have to think of the total amount of possible knowledge as a finite finitude, a finite amount, which I've represented with the area of this rectangle. And you look at 1970, we had very little knowledge of the economics. And so ignorance was, everything beyond that arc was ignorance. It was vast. Over the next 50 years, we gained lots of knowledge, and therefore we shrunk the domain of ignorance. Now, over the next 50 years, we hope to do the same. And as we continue down this road, our knowledge expands, ignorance recedes, and therefore we're more apt to do good than bad. Now, you might think that that's a really naive way to think about what economists think. Here's Christina Romer, a first-rate economist. I certainly am not criticizing her ability as economist. Here she is speaking in 2007. I think this was at the gathering organized by the Fed at Jackson Hole in the summer. And she's talking about the advance of macroeconomics. And I pick her out only because the quote is so directly reveals what I'm after here, but she was not an outlier either. There was this extraordinary hubris in macroeconomics in the period preceding the crisis that we'd really come to figure it out, that there was a great moderation, that is to say macroeconomic disturbances were declining, and that was largely because of what we economists were doing. We've seen the triumph of sensible ideas. The costly wrong turn in ideas and macro policy of the 1960s and 1970s has been righted, and the future of stabilization looks bright. Now, this is the summer of 2007, just 5 minutes before the world economy is about to fall off the cliff. Going back to the previous slide, this is kind of the imaginary I think she had in her head, she and many, many other macroeconomists, that the wrong turn of the 1970s had been righted. We'd learned, our ignorance had been reduced, and the future looked bright because we were continually marching on. Now, I think that this is fallacious, of course. I mean, I shouldn't say of course. I think that this is wrong-headed. The first point I want to make a few points here. When we know more, let's imagine that we've learned things. Do we really not know less? I want to suggest to you a number of things. One is that learning involves forgetting. That to learn more, we are necessarily putting aside things that had been learned in the past. Insights from Smith, Marx, Keynes, pick your economic pioneers who you find most persuasive. How do we know what are the right lessons to take from these folks? And how do we know that we're carrying that forward and discarding only their errors? We don't. Making matters worse, what is forgotten tends to happen randomly and is often ideologically biased by what we professors choose to put on our syllabus and by what we leave off the syllabus, and even by the offhand remarks we make from professors to students to say, no, you don't need to worry about Henry George and what he had to say about value in land. It was an error that is rightly forgotten. It happens in that kind of way. I want to suggest that learning, again, I won't read this quote by Stigler, but if you want to take a look at how Stigler thought about why we should not teach the history of thought, it's just really stunning. The point, learning involves forgetting, but there's more problems here. And this is the critical claim I want to make in what's left of my talk. I want to suggest to you that new knowledge doesn't shrink the domain of ignorance. It actually generates new, what I call salient ignorance. To give you a ridiculous example, but that gets the point, Aristotle couldn't have known the possible impacts of genome editing. He was ignorant of it, but that ignorance wasn't relevant in his day. It wasn't salient in 350 BC. It doesn't become salient until the technology, the knowledge that allows us to engage in genome editing, CRISPR technology. It's not until that technology becomes available that the ignorance about its possible impacts becomes salient. Now, I want to argue that this is true, that it's a truth about new technologies generally, that new technologies, which represent new knowledge, expanding knowledge, necessarily generate new domains of salient ignorance. The one, of course, that's got everyone's attention today is AI. But social media, blockchain technology, each involves expanded knowledge that necessarily increases the domain of salient ignorance. By salient, I mean ignorance that matters. If you've been paying attention to all the hand-wringing these days by Elon Musk and the other leaders of the AI revolution, they're calling for a pause. Why? They're calling for a pause because they argue that right now there's an arms race among different developers of AI, and that we can't begin to know what will be its impact, and we can't, let me read it. We can't understand, predict, or reliably control the impacts of AI. I think they're absolutely right. I think AI is a dramatic example of the general problem that new knowledge embedded in technology always creates new domains of salient ignorance. Here, this was past week, 1,000 of them meeting to talk about this AI getting out of control. For some of them, like Elon Musk and former Google CEO Schmidt, they argue AI poses existential threats. These aren't marginal threats on the corners of our lives. They're talking about the kinds of threats that could be world shattering. And again, I think they're right, but I want to point out, I think that this is a general issue. AI just is this problem to a much higher degree. One way to think about this argument that new knowledge creates new salient ignorance is to distinguish between different kinds of knowledge. Let's think about gun construction and use, handgun construction and use. To create guns, first there's abstract theoretical knowledge. Let's call that episteme. So for a gun, so abstract theoretical knowledge that's transmitted through textbooks. I'm thinking here in the case of a gun, thermodynamics, mechanics, ballistics, and other forms of abstract knowledge. That's necessary to build a gun. Then the existence of the gun requires how-to knowledge and craft. This, of course, is the root word of technology, technique. Here we might look at users' manuals and practice. This has to do with how to load and shoot the gun. To have technique, one need not have any episteme. One doesn't need to know thermodynamics to load and shoot a gun. One can become a very good marks person without any knowledge of mechanics and ballistics. I want to argue that whenever there's an expansion of episteme and technique, there is expanding influence in the world. Humans expand their influence when they advance episteme and technique, such as in the case I've given you, how to construct and how to use a gun. There's a third form of knowledge, phronesis or practical wisdom. This, for the case I'm giving you, would concern when to use a gun, when to carry a gun, whether to have the gun concealed, or this is an American example, I understand. When to have the book concealed as opposed to showing it on your hip, and when not to carry a gun. This is a kind of practical wisdom that can only be gained after the epistemic and technological advance that generates the gun. We can't answer these practical wisdom questions in advance. And so, advances in episteme and technique, at a minimum, create new domains or new regions of what to call it, phronesis, frenetic ignorance that cannot be answered beforehand. The problem, you see, I've demonstrated at the bottom, I've summarized at the bottom. Here's the alternative model I want us to have in our heads. I think economists need to have in our heads. This is from J.A. Wheeler. He was an extraordinary physicist of the 20th century. He was involved in the nuclear research that led to the nuclear bomb, among many other things. He was entirely on top of this problem. And in his words, so lovely, as our island of knowledge grows, so does the shore of our ignorance. I want to just change that up a bit by talking about salient ignorance. I think ignorance is infinite, so you can't increase ignorance in the way he might be suggesting there. If you think of the expanding, in his terms, knowledge as an island, the sea around it is ignorance. The shoreline is where knowledge confronts ignorance. The shoreline is what I'm calling salient ignorance. There's lots of ignorance out there that's just not interesting or important to us as of this moment. What matters is the salient ignorance. That's the shoreline. As knowledge expands, such as through the development of AI and AI tools, the shoreline where we confront our salient ignorance also expands. The point now that I'm trying to make should now be intuitively clear, I hope. When we get more knowledge, Christina Romer is wrong. As we increase our knowledge, we increase our influence in the world. We do not increase our control, and therefore the domain of salient ignorance expands. It doesn't contract. Last myth, and I'm going to finish on this, Sina. The myth, I think, that is in the head of economists let's call it an enabling assumption of the last 130 years or so, is that on account of our increasing knowledge, our social impact steadily improves. So on the horizontal axis, we've got knowledge increasing over time. Of course, I've now problematized that, but let's go with it. And that because our knowledge is increasing, our social benefit also increases. Therefore, we always have an argument for our having more and more influence in the world, because obviously our social benefit is expanding. Now, of course, if you reject the idea that we are necessarily enjoying expanding knowledge because we're forgetting things we should never forget, and because of the conundrum I just described, where increasing knowledge increases our ignorance, then we come to see that as knowledge expands, if it does expand, as knowledge expands, we cannot predict in advance whether the next increment of knowledge, that marginal change in knowledge, is going to generate more social benefit or any social benefit as opposed to social harm. Chances are that most new technologies do both, but we can't know in advance the distribution of those benefits and harms. We can't know in advance their magnitude, and we can't therefore claim, this is my point, we can't therefore claim that over time our social impact necessarily improves. All right, if you followed me, if you are on board with anything about any of what I had to say, you might be asking yourself, if we are as ignorant as I'm claiming, how can we possibly contribute to the world? We're talking about a world that's beyond control. What would responsible engagement look like? And of course, the first lesson, if you will, is to foreground our epistemic limits, especially when confronting wicked problems. Wicked problems are not well defined and all the rest. I'm going to move on just because I want to get to an instructive approach. There are lots of people who are now trying to think through how to intervene in the world responsibly in a world we can't know and we can't control. One of them I find to be really quite fascinating is called decision-making under deep uncertainty, or DMDU. If you're interested in uncertainty and you're unaware of DMDU, I highly recommend you go to the website you see at the bottom of this screen and take a look at what's being done. Let me just talk about the principles of DMDU that are relevant for us. First, you emphasize what you can't know, such as the future impacts of today's policy strategies. Given that you can't control, you have an ethical, the second point, you have an ethical imperative to empower those who stand to be harmed. Let's call them the chief stakeholders. You have an ethical duty to empower stakeholders to be much more centrally involved in policy assessment and decision-making than they tend to be under, let's say, a cost-benefit analysis. The point here is that we need to treat those whom we purport to help as having autonomy and integrity, and not just as the recipients of our expertise. Next point, and I can talk to you about any of these principles and talk to you about how this all happens. Next point, you need to seek, the argument is to seek robust strategies, not optimal strategies. By robust, we mean strategies that appear to us, with our imperfect knowledge, as having a good chance of doing well enough, not optimally, in the context of a very wide range of possible futures. Okay, what is that? You don't go for optimal strategies because optimal strategies are far too fragile and risky. What does this mean? You take a candidate policy and you run it up against tens of thousands of potential futures. You do this with this is computationally intensive, as you can imagine, but you use the best available models, knowing they're imperfect. You run a policy through a model with parameterized in a certain way, and then you run the policy through a second time, but you start to change the parameter values. You run it through a third time and 100th time and a 10,000th time and a 30,000th time, each time adjusting parameters, external variables and the like. What you're trying to do is see if each one of these runs through the model is one possible future. You want to see how a particular policy does against a wide range of these possible futures without assigning any probability distribution to those possible futures. You then bring back the stakeholders for consultation and strategy selection. And again, this is key. The ethical argument I've already presented to you. I have a whole chapter in this on the book. The economics profession has been driven by paternalism, where we know best. DMDU is about displacing paternalism with the idea that those who stand to be harmed and benefited should be systematically involved in making decisions that will bear on their future. They, not us, should be empowered to decide which risks to take in pursuit of which valued social goods. Finally, you implement a strategy, and then you immediately start to monitor the critical variables, and you adapt without end, because as over time, only one of those 30,000 worlds is going to come into existence, and maybe it's a world you didn't even model. And so you need to know that your policy decision today in 2023 will have to be amended in 24, 25, 26 as the world spins. I'm going to leave you with some quotes that I won't read. I think that we need to learn, what I'm arguing in this book is that we need to learn the way of ignorance. How do we comport ourselves responsibly in a world we can't know and we can't begin to control. And for that, I think we could do the best place to start that conversation is with the work of the extraordinary Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry was not an academic. He was an essayist, poet, novelist, but also a farmer and an agronomist who had extraordinary insights into the dangers of monocrops and industrial farming and the like. And he, as much as anyone I'm aware of, in the 20th century, understood the epistemic problem that we're talking about today. And he suggested that we're not going to ever solve the epistemic problem. What we need to do is learn the way of ignorance, how to be responsible, ethical actors in a world we cannot know and cannot control. I've given you just a few quotes from the book that I hope you find as exciting or as interesting as I do. And with that, Sina, I'm going to conclude my remarks.
Thank you immensely, George, for this wonderful presentation. I think extremely clear. I could follow you with much ease. I hope that was the case for others. So we didn't have any questions for clarification during the talk, which I think is because it was extremely clear, extremely insightful. Again, thank you so much, George. So without any further ado, I think we can begin the discussion because I know that, George, you should be leaving at around, can you remind me, at the latest, at a quarter?
Half past, or no later than quarter of, yeah, somewhere within a half an hour, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, I would, instead of starting, maybe I would give the floor to the participants. Again, I'm grateful for your participation. So please come forward with your questions, and maybe later on I would ask my own questions. So does anyone want to begin, please?
If you don't, I'm going to start talking again.
I can jump in, George. Hi, my name is
please.
Nat.
Please.
Hello, Nat.
I've been writing a book about some of this stuff myself, and it was a really interesting, insightful take you have. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role of modeling in particular in some of the dynamics that you see. And you made the distinction in Shackle between kind of, knowledge of the future and knowledge of the past. And then you sort of seem to go beyond Shackle in saying that, the past causal knowledge wasn't possible in the past. And I followed you in that. But I guess sort of my perspective and sort of, the broad, 200-year history of modern economics, it's the historical and the institutional economists who have most kind of pushed against some of this sort of hubris and speculation and sort of counterfactual. And yet, when you talked about the decision, I'll check out the DNDU. I hadn't heard of that, but that sounds excellent. But you were talking in that situation about, a lot of basis of modeling, and I just wondered whether, whether you saw modeling as whether it has to just involve substituting the reality for this kind of fake counterfactual world, or whether it's actually something that can be used, or whether we could use knowledge of the past. I hope that was somewhat clear.
Good. Well, you tell me if I'm responding well enough to what you've put before us. And as concerns the literature on the historical school, I'm not a scholar in that area, but I know I certainly know enough about those who have pushed back against this, axiomatic deductive reasoning as the key to understanding the truth of the economy in all places at all times, independent of context. But I would have to learn that from you. So I'm not going to have much to say about the German school and all the rest. As concerns modeling, the question, as concerns knowledge of the past and modeling, we can't get away from knowledge of the past. What else do we have? But we need to be clear about what it is we think we have when we think we have knowledge of the past. What we have, I'm trying to suggest, are fictitious claims about causal properties in the past, and that's all we're ever going to get, and that's true of the past, the present, and the future. If you go down that road, then the next question is, then what are we doing with our models? Are we trying to prove a causal relationship in the past that we can then depend on when we intervene today to bring about some intended outcome in the future? Or, and this is the DMDU strategy, do we use our models as a basis for not teasing out the singularly right counterfactual? Do we use our models instead to engage in wildly creative counterfactualizing, where what we're trying to do is use, in this case, machines and the like, to help us expand the range of possible futures that we cannot, where we cannot know which event, if any of them, or if any of them, will actually map onto the future. So what's at stake here is, what do we think counterfactuals should do? Far too many people, in my humble opinion, think that counterfactuals can give us the truth as concerns causality, or at least a dependable causality. I want to argue that that's a mistake. And by the way, if you were to look at my book, or I've written a recent article in the Review of Evolutionary Political Economy, where I go into this in more detail than in the book, you'll see that I'm actually, these are not ideas unique to me. There have been some wonderful scholars who have really spent, like Weber and Farron and others, I cite them, who have really thought through how we should use counterfactuals. The fact of the matter is, just as we can't escape causality stories in our heads, we can't escape counterfactualizing. It's one of the highest faculties of the human brain, according to people like Judea Pearl, the great computer scientist, or Nassim Taleb. They argue that counterfactualizing is one of the things that separates us from other human species, and it's a good thing too, because if we couldn't counterfactualize, we wouldn't be here as a species, because the world's too dangerous. We have to navigate it by counterfactualizing. Okay, now to get back to your point. There are tremendously rich ways of using counterfactualizing. One is to help us imagine possible worlds for which we are not well prepared, and to help us start to think about how to prepare for these potentially dangerous worlds. That is the exciting, I would argue, the socially responsible way for us to be using counterfactuals, as opposed to using our models to create the uniquely correct counterfactual.
May I come back very briefly, or is that not? Oh, okay. That's fascinating. I guess the pushback would be whether the models themselves, whether we believe that they represent the world, whereas actually they're massive, huge simplifications of the world. So if we think we're actually doing counterfactual of the world, we're actually confusing ourselves. And I think it was George Box said the good scientist must not be like Pygmalion and fall in love with his model. And I think
exactly. So if you take a look at, okay, so here's where I would direct you to get a quick and dirty but very useful introduction to this way of thinking. The DMDU folks, I'm not in this community. I don't do the work, but I've been studying them now for a while. If you go to the website, if you just Google DMDU Society, you will find an open access textbook, the PDF, which you can download, which now kind of brings together contemporary thinking on DMDU. Just read the first chapter, which is an introduction, and then the next chapter, which is by Robert Lempert, who is one of the really extraordinary thinkers in this area. And they're going to make the point that you just made, which is to say that we begin with the best of models we have, augmented by the insights and knowledge of the stakeholders who are most deeply engaged in the real world in these areas. But we know that these are fictions. Any model is a story of a world that can't possibly exist, because a model of the world that it really is an infinitely large model, and we know we're not doing that. And so we had better be aware that we're going to be wrong in terms of specifying the boundaries of the systems that we think we're operating in. We're going to be wrong in terms of the variables that come into this model, this system from other systems. We're going to have the parameters wrong. And in any event, even if we had all that right for yesterday, by tomorrow the world may have changed, but the world doesn't tell us when it's changing. So even if we had a dependable model for 6 minutes ago, we can't bet our lives on the fact that that model is dependable. I'm not going to say right because it's not right. 6 minutes hence. So the question then is, Nat, if you believe all that, then do we have any role to play? How do we use our expertise, if at all, to support good decision making? The answer for this crowd is to use your models to generate a wide range of possible fictitious futures, and then think about what do we need to do to be prepared to do in order to prepare ourselves against the ones that are really, really dangerous. It's a satisfying, the goal is to satisfy. Robustness means doing well enough against innumerable futures, not maximizing anything. If you go down that road now and you take a look, and if you are unhappy with this, I would love to hear from you to see what to tell me what you think, and we can continue this conversation.
Thank you.
Sorry, maybe just before giving, because I saw that David Brown, you raised some questions in the chat, so I would give you the floor. But just rapidly about this question of engaging with the stakeholders in their approach of decision making under deep uncertainty. Let's say, I don't know, let's take an international organization, let's say the United Nations, which is about voting, let's say, something, a law or something binding at the international level. Then I don't understand what is the, I mean, in what sense? So in that sense, the stakeholders would be like everybody. So how can you possibly take them into account?
Well,
I mean, I don't see how the question of directly implicating the stakeholders in the analysis, I don't see how it can work for decisions that involve a large number of stakeholders.
Well, let me give you, let's take a more local example, but that nevertheless raises the point. I live in the west of the United States. We have a crisis, a climate-induced crisis. Well, not just climate, a population and climate-induced crisis, which is to say that the Colorado River supplies water to 40 million people. It also provides, so that's not the world. That's not 8 billion people, Sina, but 40 million probably meets your criteria of a large number of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. It satisfies the water needs of 7 basin states. It doesn't satisfy anymore. But it supplies water to 7 basin states. I don't know how many Native American reservations, and the northern part of Mexico. And the river is running dry in the sense that it no longer generates enough water to meet the needs. And so the 2 biggest reservoirs in the United States, which have got to be 2 of the biggest reservoirs in the world, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, are now collapsing. They're down to a level, but we just happen to have a lot of snow this year, so the problem has been kicked off 6 months. But they're down to a level that's almost at dead pool status, which means they're going to be so low that you won't even be able to turn the turbines that generate power. We're talking about water going to the Imperial Valley in California. It comes from this very same river. This generates an extraordinary amount of food that is shipped around the world and consumed in the United States. So this is an example. In 2012, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, which is responsible for this river, was about to do its long-term projections and come up with policy interventions. And instead of doing that, by the way, this story does not have a happy answer, but I'm trying to address, it doesn't have a happy ending, but I'm trying to address Sina's point. Decided to go a different way. It brought in DMDU researchers from the RAND Corporation. Interestingly enough, that's where a lot of this work is being done in California. And rather than predicting what the future would be like, and then coming up with optimal strategies. It convened meetings of stakeholders, and this gets to Sina's question. Who did it bring in? Well, didn't bring in 40 million people, representatives of major constituencies. So representatives of Native American tribes, representatives of urban water planners, ranchers, people running cattle out here in the West, critically important, farmers who are doing other kinds of crops. We have an enormous environmental community. Environmentalist representatives were brought in. We have people who live off the river in all different kinds of ways, such as rafting industry, fly fishing industry, and so forth. The stakeholders, the chief stakeholders, the idea was to bring in those who speak for the diverse constituencies who are affected by this river. So we're talking dozens and dozens of people, not thousands of people, who stand in some relation to their constituencies in a leadership way. And off they went to do a DMDU pilot project to see what they can learn about a DMDU approach as opposed to a more traditional predict then act kind of model. So now, Sina, that's what we're talking about, bringing in representatives of constituencies who are seen to be principally affected. Is it perfect? Of course not. It's, really not perfect for all the reasons you can start to intuit about power and all the rest. But for me, it's one way to start to change how we think about the relationship between the economic expert and those the economic expert purports to serve. I'll stop there because I'm talking too much, but.
Thank you so much. So David, do you want to ask your question or discuss your comment vocally?
Yeah, all right. Can you hear? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 Yeah, my background, I'm an agricultural economist, Connecticut farm boy who went to UConn, Cornell, Iowa State under Earl Hetty, had a career half in the U.S., University, Tennessee, Texas A&M, Iowa State, and half overseas with USAID projects, Agricultural Development Council, which is a foundation, 5 years of the FAO, Chief of Situation Outlook in Rome, and troubleshooting. I would... So I think we can think more in terms of economics as a backbone, so to speak. And I would add to what I put online here. Some of the most productive involvements have been actually having workshops, training workshops, not just training, but having the participants. USAID used to do this where I'd come into Washington, D.C. for a 4-week short course. 3 of the 4 weeks would be with the middle-level managers or with top policymakers from various countries. Then we'd take the 4th week, go out to Tennessee and actually have a case situation, like in the hills of North Carolina. How do you reduce runoff into the Tennessee River and at the same time generate enough income for the hill farmers to make it all right, kind of a thing. And you can do it for a lot of pricing policies and so on. We've done this in places like Ghana and Indonesia, in Pakistan, where I was my last assignment. So maybe the point I'm trying to add here is maybe less doing in isolation and less preoccupation with journal articles that you have to pay for, which I think is a crime. And if you're on public monies, and doing more kind of analysis by actually being immersed in the situation.
Okay, I fundamentally agree. May I jump in, Sina?
Yeah, I've said too much.
No. I fundamentally agree. My previous sole authored book to this one was called The Economist's Oath. And one of the chapters was on training the ethical economist. And I was really quite inspired by some of the work being done by places that surprised me, even the World Bank, on what are called immersion and dialogue programs, wherein economists working for, let's just say the World Bank, are placed in the communities, let's say in a relatively low income country, in the rural areas, the very communities that they purport to be advocating for and developing policies for, they're actually immersed in these communities for some period of time. By the way, David, how long are these immersions? They tend to be only 5 days, which is ridiculous, but okay, let's grant that at least it's the right idea. The idea is for the economist who is legislating for these communities to actually get to know the people that they're legislating for, to be immersed in their communities so that they have a much more organic connection to those whom they purport to serve. One of the partner institutions in this project is SIWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, which helped place World Bank economists in rural communities, living with women in their homes, and working with them in the fields, but again, just for a week, and then coming back together and dialoguing with the leaders of SIWA about what they'd learned and how that might affect their practice. Now, if you and I were becoming a doctor, we would have an apprenticeship. If you and I were becoming an architect, we'd have an apprenticeship, an engineer. Economics doesn't have apprenticeships. We do the three essay dissertation, and boom, we go out in the world and start intervening in people's lives. I think that this has to be overcome with the kinds of immersions, David, that you're hinting at. And not, of course, 5 days doesn't begin to get at it. We need serious apprenticeships where people are located in the supply and demand side of economic expertise to learn, to start to gain the phronesis, the practical wisdom I was talking about earlier.
Thank you so much, Nahid. By the way, Nahid Aslanbekui is the speaker of the next session of this seminar, one of the most important historians of economic thought, amazing work on Pigou, is precisely one of those rare economists who paid lots of attention to normative issues, specifically issues involving inequality. So Nahid, please.
I hope to be there.
Yes, thank you for your lecture today. If a doctor harms a patient, he or she is subject to malpractice suit in the United States at least.
Mm-hmm.
If a lawyer harms a client, the same thing is true. Why is it that economists have been able to evade accountability
Yeah. This is
for a long, long time, although their advice can affect billions of people around the world?
Yeah, you've heard the joke, how many economists lost their jobs as a consequence of the crisis of 2008?
Right.
Nobody's lost their jobs. This is such a fascinating question. There's so many aspects to it, so I'm just going to kind of give you a quick list. There are professions that deal with clients one-on-one. So let's say clinical medicine, where let's call it the causal chain, is pretty short. You come to me with a medical ailment, I send you home with some pills, I have misdiagnosed you, you take the pills, you're harmed by the pills, or maybe you're harmed because I didn't notice that your condition was quite different from the one I thought I was treating. You get very sick and die. The causal connection is, at least intuitively, or it seems to be quite short. But now think about the intervention of an economist who supplies a cost-benefit analysis to the city council of Paris, and the city council takes it and makes a decision that's influenced by the cost-benefit analysis. Of course, the cost-benefit analysis is wrong by an order of magnitude. Things don't work out anything like. Lots of people suffer in ways that weren't anticipated. But now the causal chain there, if you think in terms of causality, the causal chain is really quite long and it's indirect. The economist invariably will say something like this: well, yes, it didn't go the way I had laid out, but that's because, and then give us a long list of explanations as to why, through no fault of the economist, the policy didn't have the intended effects. This, by the way, the distance also in time between the decision of writing the report and the harmful effects might be 6 months, but much more likely it's going to be 6 years, 16 years, 25 years. In these kinds of contexts, it is very difficult to trace back the harms over here to the intervention over here, or at least to put it another way, it is very easy for the economist who was involved in this to dissociate him or herself themselves from any harmful outcomes. I think Jeffrey Sachs is the best example of this. He intervened all over the world. In some places, things went very badly. And after the fact, he never said, I got it wrong, I'm implicated in these hardships. He would say things like, well, I told them to do 70 things, they only did 35. Again, here's the problem of mistaking influence for control. He's essentially saying, don't blame me, I didn't have control. So when the things went wrong, it's not because of my intervention, it's because of the imperfect politicians or the imperfect policy levers, that not because of anything I did. And we can move on and we sleep well at night because it's really hard to pin responsibility on the actor. I think that this is one of the reasons why economic evaluation at the World Bank and the IMF is both so important and has proven to be so difficult. Both of those institutions now have offices that do evaluation, but evaluating whether a policy implemented 20 years ago is responsible for the impact today is theoretically fraught and politically contested in a way that the doctor's intervention with the patient tends not to be. That's just the very beginning of what should be a much longer conversation about how hard it is for us to hold ourselves accountable for our impacts in the world.
Thank you.
There's always the counterfactual argument that, well, no, things didn't go well, but for me, things would have gone even worse. We get into the realm of competing counterfactuals. And as I've tried hard to argue here, there's no science for identifying which is the uniquely correct one.
I think we still maybe have time for one last question, if you don't mind, George. One very last question.
That'd be fine. I'd be happy to.
Okay, so Yazid, please. The floor is yours.
Hello. I'm sorry, I can't use the camera. My question is on George, you discussed a lot of things regarding economics on the epistemological level. I'm wondering if you have taken into your account the ontological level of the whole discussion, because I mean, a lot of what you said resonates so much with critical realism and Tony Lawson's works, and it felt so much, critical realist in many, many aspects. I'm wondering why you have not spent some time, or maybe haven't taken into, as I said, into your consideration, the ontological foundation of all of this, because epistemologically speaking, it's still lacking the ontological perspective into all of this. Thank you very much.
You know who has made that point to me on many occasions? Tony. This is an area where I have immense respect for critical realism, the whole tradition, and of course Tony Lawson in particular. When a couple of times when he's written to me about something else, he always asks me, how's my ontology working, because he thinks I don't have one. And the reason he thinks that is because I don't always begin there in a way that a critical realist might. I once wrote to Tony to ask him about his take on counterfactualizing, and it's just never been, if I understood him correctly, it's never been really central to his work, perhaps because of his grounding in the ontological. I don't think by the way, I'm not dealing with epistemology, I would argue, at all in this book. I'm arguing, by which I mean truth claims. I'm not interested. I'm deeply interested in epistemology, but not in this book. I'm interested in epistemic claims, which is entirely different from epistemological claims. If I were making epistemological claims, I think you'd be right. I should have something to say about ontology. And to some degree, I do, in the sense that I draw on a lot, or at least I'm drawing on a lot of people who have a kind of ontology in their mind that's different from critical realism, but which foregrounds complexity. I'm going to put that away, though, because that's not my primary concern in the book. I'm not interested in this book. I'm not pursuing the epistemological. I'm pursuing the epistemic, by which I mean what we can and cannot, what we do and don't, and can and cannot have access to in the world, what we can know, what we can't know. I think of that as an epistemic question. I think of epistemological question as the grounding of the truth claims that we make about the world. So to get back to you, if you're a critical realist, you will find this unsatisfying perhaps, but I'm not dealing with epistemology at all in this book. Were I to, then I think you're quite right. I'd be pressed into having some ontological grounding for any epistemological claim that I'm making, but I'm not making those claims in this book. I don't know if that would satisfy you, and I don't know if that would satisfy Tony, but that's how I think about this issue. Well, let me ask you in the last 30 seconds, what do you think of that counter?
I mean, I love the way you actually have put all the claims and the counterclaims. I mean, it's I mean, your argument is well founded in many aspects when it comes to basically criticizing all the kind of modeling the economists actually do. I do really find it so interesting, but maybe something that is still haunting me is what is then the status of economics at the moment, because it's still there, solid science that is actually manipulating, if I want to put it this way, the whole working mechanisms of our world politics even.
Yeah, I think that if you're saying in my terms, economics as a science remains extraordinarily influential. If you're arguing that it doesn't deserve that level of influence, that a lot of it is predicated on a falsehood, that we have time travel machines, I completely disagree. Excuse me, I completely agree with you if you're making any of those kinds of claims.
And just before maybe we finish, maybe a very rapid comment. I think one of the things I tend to find very problematic with the standard economics, what we sometimes call neoclassical economics, is that apparently, it is founded on this idea that, people have individual subjective preferences. There is nothing objective. There is nothing of normatively objective that we could possibly say, and that we should let each person decide on their own. And then on the other hand, they have the largest level of influence among all social scientists. For us, some, for example, heterodox strands of economics, they tend to focus on some specific priorities, some very specific questions. On those questions, they might claim some sort of expertise. They might even be paternalistic, but only regarding a specific points. Whereas neoclassical economists, they say, well, we are not paternalistic because precisely we say that each person, to each her or his own preferences and everything.
Yes, exactly.
Completely, but on the other hand, they are giving advice at all levels.
And not just giving advice, using all the tools available to them to achieve their vision. And for me, that's why I have a whole chapter making the argument that despite themselves, they're paternalists, and that's an inappropriate ethic for the 21st century.
Absolutely. I mean, the point is that they don't even want to assume their paternalism. I find this also one of the problems, in the sense that they are paternalistic, but they don't want to assume it.
Yes.
So supposedly they start with this Paretian idea that each person has their own preferences and nothing justifies like prioritizing one preference over another. Yes. But thank you immensely, George, really so much for this very insightful talk. It was a huge pleasure and honor to have you in this seminar. Thank you so much also to all the participants. I greatly appreciate because this seminar only works thanks to your participation. So the next session will be in around a month, on the 27th of October. We'll have the opportunity to listen to Nahid Aslam Begui's talk on the heritage of on PIGU, specifically on the question of externalities, basically the externality tradition, the Piguian tradition in externality analysis. So it's going to be on the 27th of October. We'll start at the same time, 6 p.m. Central European time. Of course, I will send you reminders for that session in due time. Thank you again to all of you. Thank you so much to George again. I really appreciate your part I really enjoyed immensely your talk, and I am really grateful that you accepted to participate.
I want to thank you, Sina, and I want to thank the attendees for giving me your attention and for your comments. I so appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Very kind of you. Have an excellent morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are, and hope to see you for the next session in October.
Bye-bye.